This happened in 2022, back when I was living in the Bay Area, Oakland specifically. One weekend, I drove north to visit my parents in Eureka. If you've never taken Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's stunning during the day. At night, though, especially north of the Bay, it's a completely different experience. Long, isolated stretches, no streetlights, barely any traffic, spotty or non-existent cell service. It feels endless and strangely oppressive once the sun goes down. I left my parents' house around 8 p.m. on a Sunday. In hindsight, that was a mistake. I should have stayed the night and driven back Monday morning, but I had an early shift and convinced myself it would be better to just power through the 4-hour drive. That decision still bothers me. The first couple of hours were uneventful. Once you get farther north, Highway 101 narrows into long 2-lane stretches. It was somewhere near Trinidad when the fog rolled in. Fog isn't unusual along that coast, but this was different. Within 5 minutes, visibility dropped from perfectly clear to barely 20 feet ahead of my headlights. It was disorienting in a way that's hard to describe. The world just vanished beyond a short tunnel of light. I slowed down to about 35 miles per hour. Pulling over would have been smarter, but there aren't many safe turnouts in that area, and I just wanted to get home. I told myself that if I drove carefully, I'd be fine. What people don't always realize about heavy fog is how much it messes with your sense of space. You lose landmarks, and you can't judge distance. You don't know how far you've traveled or what's ahead. Combined with exhaustion, it plays tricks on your mind. About 30 minutes later, I noticed something on the shoulder ahead, a shape standing just off the road. At first, it looked like nothing more than a dark outline in the mist. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. A tall man, from what I could tell, standing rigidly and facing the road. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't on a phone. He was just standing there. I slowed even more as I passed him, worried he might step into the road. He didn't move. He didn't even turn his head to watch my car go by. I got a clear look at his face in my headlights, and nothing about it seemed obviously abnormal. My first thought was that maybe his car had broken down and he was waiting for help. But I hadn't seen any disabled vehicles, and there was absolutely nothing around him. Just trees and fog. I briefly considered turning around to ask if he needed assistance. Something about the situation felt wrong, though, off in a way I couldn't explain. So I kept driving. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. Same height, same dark clothing, same posture. Only this time he was standing on the left shoulder instead of the right. I actually said, "What the hell?" out loud. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on the road. There were no side roads, no visible paths, nothing. As I passed him the second time, I forced myself to look. I needed to confirm whether it was the same person. It was. I'm certain of it. But this time, as I drove by, his head snapped toward me and our eyes locked. I felt my stomach drop. There was something deeply unsettling about how fast he moved, how intentionally he made eye contact. I looked away immediately and pressed the gas, pushing up to 45 despite the thick fog. I wanted distance between us. The fog only got worse. I could barely see the center line anymore, so I slowed again. My thoughts were racing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were two different men. Maybe I'd somehow looped around. None of it made sense. Then, just a few minutes later, my headlights revealed another figure ahead, standing directly in the middle of the road. I had no choice but to stop. This person wore a hood that obscured his face. He stood perfectly still, blocking the entire lane. I flashed my brights several times. No reaction, no movement. I shifted into reverse. When I checked my rearview mirror, I felt my heart slam into my ribs. There was someone behind my car walking toward it. I yelled and threw the car back into drive. I was trapped. Someone in front of me, someone behind me. Panic took over. I swerved into the opposite lane and sped around the hooded figure. He didn't try to stop me. For a split second, I thought I'd escaped. Then something slammed violently into the back of my car. It wasn't a light bump. The impact jolted the entire vehicle sideways. I heard the crunch of metal and instinctively assumed another car had rear-ended me. But when I looked in my mirror, there was nothing there. No headlights, no people, nothing but fog. I didn't stop. I drove as fast as I safely could until I reached the 101 interchange where visibility improved. My breathing finally slowed. My mind began trying to make sense of it. The explanation I settled on was exhaustion-induced hallucination. I'd been driving for nearly 4 hours, staring into dense fog. Maybe my brain filled in details that weren't there. The figures, the crash, all of it. It seemed plausible. But when I arrived home and stepped out of the car, that explanation collapsed. The rear bumper was destroyed. A massive dent stretched across most of it, deep and unmistakable. There was no paint transfer, nothing to suggest another vehicle had hit me. But something had. Hard. I stood there for several minutes just staring at the damage. I reported the incident to the police, though there wasn't much to report beyond what I'd seen. Over the years, I've replayed that night countless times. The most logical explanation I can accept is that I hallucinated the figures and in my panic struck a guardrail post or roadside marker. But here's what I struggle with. I can accept hallucinating one thing. What I can't reconcile is hallucinating multiple people in different positions while simultaneously experiencing a real physical collision. The damage to my car was undeniable. And sometimes when I think about how that man locked eyes with me in the fog, I can't shake the feeling that something else was out there on Highway 101 that night. Something far more deliberate than my exhausted mind. This happened during spring break earlier this year. I'm a senior in college now, and like I usually do, I went back to my hometown for the week. The problem with going home is that there's absolutely nothing to do. It's one of those suburban towns that sits close enough to a city to claim it, but far enough away to lack anything interesting. No nightlife, no bars within walking distance, no real activity. At school, I'm constantly busy. Back home, everything feels frozen in time. To make it worse, none of my hometown friends had the same break schedule as me. They were either still in class or had already finished their break weeks earlier. I was looking at 7 days of isolation. I'd also been trying to clean up my habits, cut back on nicotine and drinking. I figured a boring week at home could either derail that effort or give me a chance to reset. So I decided I'd work out twice a day, lift in the mornings, run in the afternoons, stay disciplined, stay distracted. That's how I ended up going for a run that Tuesday around 5 p.m. Back in high school, when I ran cross-country, I had a 3-mile loop I used constantly. It starts at my house, cuts through my neighborhood for about a quarter mile, then enters a wooded trail. That trail winds through a small forest and eventually spits you back onto the street about a block from my driveway. It's a single path, no forks, no alternate routes. I'd run it hundreds, maybe thousands of times. The second I stepped outside, I noticed the fog. It was unnaturally thick. I've lived in that town my whole life, and I'd never seen fog like that. Everything beyond 30 or 40 feet dissolved into white haze. It almost looked artificial, like a video game render distance had been turned down. I considered skipping the run, but I talked myself out of it. The trail was simple, straight, familiar. I could have done it blindfolded. I started running. The fog was worse inside the woods. The trees blocked out what little light remained, and I could barely see 15 feet ahead. Still, the path was clear underfoot. For the first mile and a half, everything felt normal. Slower pace, sure, but manageable. At 2.5 miles, though, something felt off. At that distance, I should have been nearing the end. There's a specific curve to the left, then a small incline, and you're back on pavement. I know that section by heart, but I was still deep in the woods. I checked my watch, 2.5 miles. I told myself the GPS was glitching. The watch was a few years old, maybe the trees or fog interfered with the signal. I kept running. When my watch hit 3 miles, I should have been standing in my driveway. Instead, I was still surrounded by trees. That's when I stopped. There was only one path. I hadn't turned off anywhere. I hadn't stepped into brush or undergrowth. Getting lost in that trail wasn't possible unless I deliberately left it. And I hadn't. I looked at my watch again. 3.1 miles. The distance was still ticking up even though I was standing still. Okay, GPS malfunction, that made sense. I decided to turn around and retrace my steps. If I ran back the way I came, I'd eventually hit the trailhead where I started. From there, I knew exactly how to get home. So I turned around. The fog had somehow gotten worse. After about a mile of running back, so roughly 4 total miles at that point, I heard something. The woods are usually dead quiet, too small for much wildlife. That's part of why I like running there. The sound I heard didn't belong. The closest description I can give is a moan, but that's not accurate. It was deeper, sustained, a low droning noise that rose and fell in intensity, almost like a siren, but distinctly organic. Human, but wrong. It wasn't someone calling for help. It didn't sound like pain. It was just a wavering, continuous tone. And it was behind me. I ran faster. But I'd already been running for miles. My legs were heavy, my lungs burned. The more I pushed, the more exhausted I became, and the more exhausted I became, the more panicked I felt. The sound didn't fade. It matched my pace. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing but fog. I ran like that for what felt like forever. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the street. I nearly collapsed from exhaustion. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying not to throw up. The fog outside was still thick. I turned around to look back at the trail entrance. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the path, just beyond the trailhead, was a shape. A tall, dark silhouette. It was massive. I'm 6 feet 1 inch, and this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall. It wasn't moving toward me or away from me, it just stood there, swaying slightly. If it hadn't been swaying, I might have convinced myself it was a tree. But it moved, subtly, rhythmically. The droning sound had stopped. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I ran home without looking back. That was a few weeks ago. I'm back at school now, but I can't get that image out of my head. That tall black mass in the fog, that unnatural sound. My parents think it was just a tall person trying to scare me. Or worse, but that explanation doesn't work for me. How could someone that tall run behind me for miles while making that sound continuously? How could they keep pace without ever appearing in the fog? I don't know what was in those woods that night, and I'm not sure I want to find out. This happened about 6 years ago in late September. My friend Edwin and I had been talking for nearly 2 years about kayaking Willapa Bay on the Washington coast. It's a massive tidal estuary, around 25 miles long, mostly oyster farms and wildlife refuge. On a clear day, it's one of the most peaceful places you'll ever see. The weekend we chose was not a clear day. Neither of us were beginners. We'd both grown up kayaking, and Edwin had even worked as a guide during college. We understood tides, navigation, fog patterns. None of this was new to us. We launched early Saturday morning from a small put-in near Nakota. The fog was thick, but coastal fog usually burns off by mid-morning, so we weren't worried. We had a GPS, a compass, and a planned route. Paddle toward Long Island, explore a bit, have lunch on a sandbar, then head back before the tide shift. The first hour felt normal. The fog muffled everything like we were moving through a padded room. Visibility was maybe 40 feet in any direction. We stayed within 15 feet of each other and checked our bearings often. Around 9 a.m., I heard it. A splashing sound. At first, I assumed it was Edwin adjusting his paddle stroke. but when I glanced over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He looked at me and asked if I'd heard it too. We stopped paddling. There it was again. It wasn't a paddle. It was the rhythmic dip and pull of oars. A distinct rowing pattern, wood against water. That's different from the double-bladed paddles we were using. It sounded close, maybe 100 feet off to our right. We figured it was another boat out on the bay. Fishermen sometimes use small rowboats, and sound behaves strangely over water, especially in fog. It can seem closer or farther than it really is. Edwin called out, "Hello?" No response. The rowing continued, steady, measured, unchanging. We resumed paddling, expecting the other boat to eventually appear through the haze. But over the next 20 minutes, the sound neither approached nor drifted away. It kept perfect distance with us. That's when it started to feel wrong. At one point, we shifted our course slightly east, angling toward shore. For just a few seconds, the fog thinned enough for me to see it. A small wooden rowboat sitting low in the water. I could make out a single figure at the oars. Then the fog swallowed it again. The glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he'd seen it. He nodded. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made it worse. Something about the situation felt deeply unsettling. The person hadn't acknowledged us, hadn't responded, hadn't altered course or pace, just kept rowing. And somehow, matching us. Eventually, I said we should head for shore. Edwin agreed without hesitation. Navigating toward land in thick fog isn't simple. Sandbars shift, channels run shallow. You can easily beat yourself in mud. We moved as efficiently as possible, checking GPS constantly. The rowing sound stayed with us. Then, without warning, the fog began to thin. Not completely, but enough that visibility extended to nearly 100 yards. I immediately looked to my right. Nothing. No boat, no silhouette, no ripples. Just open water. I checked behind us. Empty. The sound had stopped. The silence felt heavier than the noise ever did. About 5 minutes later, the shoreline came into view. We paddled straight in, not caring about the ideal landing spot. I jumped out into knee-deep water and dragged my kayak up onto the sand. Edwin did the same. We stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring back out at the bay. Still empty. Edwin wandered up the beach while I secured my gear. A minute later, he called me over. There were footprints. Barefoot, wet, leading out of the water and up onto the sand. They were fresh, water still pooled inside the impressions. The prints didn't stop at the beach. They walked a few feet inland, then turned and followed the shoreline before angling toward the tree line and disappearing into the woods. I traced them with my eyes. They seemed to originate farther down the shore. Whoever made them had come from the water. Edwin said we should leave. Immediately. But something inside me wouldn't let it go. I told him I wanted to follow the prints. Not into the trees, but back the way they came. I needed to see where they started. He thought I was insane, but he didn't want to stand alone either. So we followed them along the shoreline. After a couple of minutes, I saw it. About 50 yards down the beach sat a small wooden rowboat pulled up at an angle onto the sand. Dark wood, oars resting inside. The same boat I'd seen through the fog. I'm certain of it. A trail of wet footprints led from the boat toward the exact stretch of beach where we had landed, then onward into the trees. I instinctively stepped toward it. Edwin grabbed my arm. He said we were leaving, not discussing, leaving. Something in his voice shifted me from curiosity to pure fear. Whoever had been in that boat would have had to reach shore before us in a slower vessel. Walk down the shoreline to the precise spot we chose to land without knowing where we would land, and then still have time to disappear into the forest. It made no sense. We ran back to our kayaks, shoved them into the water, and paddled away faster than we probably should have. We didn't speak much on the way back. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone docked earlier and we misjudged timing. Maybe the fog distorted sound direction. Maybe the glimpse I saw wasn't the same boat. But the timing doesn't work. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We changed direction multiple times. When we finally committed to shore, we went straight there. For someone in a slower rowboat to reach land first, walk that distance and disappear all unseen feels impossible. I don't know who or what was rowing beside us in the fog that morning, and I'm not sure I want to know.